When I came back to my hometown for the summer vacation a few years ago, I happened to encounter something very strange that obsessed me and my friends. My village had a large stream near the forest edge. The water was always rolling like in the sea, but the water level was not that high. Some other children in the village and I had a hobby of going to the stream to catch fish. We felt safe when we played here because the water level was just above our knees. Our favorite game was always a fishing contest in which we compete to see who would catch the most fish. We all loved this game so much that we kept playing until it was nearly dark. We would catch a small fish only until the sun went down and the sunset embraced my village. When we saw the fish struggling in the basket, we all shouted with delight as if we had discovered a treasure. More or less, fish we caught were placed in a large bucket of water next to us to be taken home for dinner. We were discussing bringing these fish home as the sky darkened, when I happened to notice a shadow at the head of the river. Curiosity drove me to turn my gaze to the shadowy figure of the large man in front of me. I tried to look around to see who this man was, but I couldn't recognize him. In the dim light, I noticed a large man with a bloated stomach and pale skin. His head was bald, his face was lifeless, and he kept his gaze fixed on the rushing flow. When I noticed this, I summoned my friends and gazed into the direction of the enigmatic giant man. The other boys were surprised to see the man, believing that they had never seen him before in my village. Suddenly, this man turned to face us and waved at us. As soon as I realized this, I turned to my friends and asked if they wanted to go to the mysterious man's place. We were hesitant and scared at first because we were meeting strangers. My friends even called out to that man, but he didn't respond. He kept staring at us, his behavior enigmatic but inviting. His hand kept beckoning us. We began to wonder at this point. My backup friend advised me to give a try and go to the man to check it out. So we all decided to run to this big man to find out who he was. We dashed off and called out loud to ask for his name, but he remained silent in the distance. I could see this man until I was only a few meters away, and suddenly I couldn't see him anymore. When we arrived at his previous location, we discovered him lying on a large rock. His entire body became stiff and motionless. His skin was the same color as the large rock below. We got close to this big man at this point, realizing he might be as big as a rock in the middle of the river, which made us both scared and curious. We formed a circle around the man, gradually learning about his strange behavior. Suddenly he opened his eyes. A strange pair of eyes that didn't look human glared at me, and he looked like a corpse instead of a human. We all screamed in terror and immediately took a step back. We didn't start running home until we saw him standing up straight and we forgot our fish tank. When I got home, I immediately told my parents about the incident on the stream bank. My face flushed with fear. The adults in the house began to go out to check, inadvertently meeting my friends' families and hearing the same story. I was alone in my room that night, not daring to leave, anxiously awaiting my parents' response. In my mind, I suddenly remembered the story of the giant stone man that my grandmother had always told me when I was a child, and I felt a chill. Instead of being obsessed by the giant stone man on the other side of the river, I decided to go to bed early. After a while of thinking, I began to feel tired. My eyes were closed, and I was about to fall asleep. But as night fell, I was startled to feel a cold wind blowing into my room, just like what I felt like at the riverbank. Before I could understand what was going on, there was a very loud noise passing by my house outside my room's windows, which piqued my interest enough that I had to wake up to investigate. Looking out the windows, I noticed a figure approaching, still holding a large bronze gong and occasionally knocking on it. Everyone in my village could hear the sound of bronze gongs, but every time this man passed by any house, the windows and main door were slammed shut. I was the only one who opened the windows and looked outside to see what was going on because I was too curious. I tried to hide behind the wall, hoping no one would notice me as I waited for the man with the gongs to arrive. A figure appeared a few moments later. I recognized the faint shadow of the giant I met earlier on the riverbank from afar. He was walking straight towards my house, trailed by a shaman who was striking a gong to indicate the way. When the man arrived at my house, I noticed that there were still a few cracks on his body that looked like a large rock had been broken into pieces. The shaman in the back walked behind the giant, holding the gong and knocking each time, mumbling the incantation as if guiding him. The gong sounded very loud. The more I heard it, the more my ears became numb, and it became louder and louder. An unpleasant fishy odor suddenly arose from the giant's body as he began to approach in front of my windows. At this point, I realized with horror that this stone man was not only a massive rock in the shape of a human, but also a corpse. As he walked, he lowered his face to the ground, his eyes gleaming like the devil's. Wherever he went, the flesh on his body fell to the ground and formed murky puddles that resembled river water. His flesh began to disintegrate, forming pools of water one by one along the road in my village, smelling like fish. I saw the horror scene unfolding in front of my eyes and had to scream in fear. My yell inadvertently struck the giant in front of me. He abruptly changed color, his sight softened, and his face was startled, as if he had just realized something. He began to turn his face to look directly at me, leaving me perplexed and confused as how to handle it. He glared at me with evil eyes. His mouth began to decompose, and his teeth were nearly completely gone. Then, he approached my windows as if he was about to break in and take me away. In a panic, I jumped back intending to close the windows to protect myself. The shaman walking behind saw everything at the precise moment. He appeared to recognize the danger in front of me. His eyes became more serious. He struck the bronze gong right away, and the sound of the gong immediately drew the giant's attention. Then he turned to me and told me to be quiet. After that, he knocked the gong repeatedly while mumbling the incantation. The gong's sound was becoming increasingly loud. When this giant heard the gong, he suddenly floated into the air and became motionless, creating a ghostly and frightening scene. The shaman then knocked the gong and hurried to get the stone giant out of the village as soon as possible, not forgetting to tell me to close the windows and stop being nosy. I was too curious at the time, and I couldn't control myself, so I stayed by the window frame, keeping an eye on the figure that was slowly vanishing. The shaman then turned and led his massive stone man down a path that led into the forest by the river, where we played at this afternoon. I winced, perplexed. I had no idea what the hell this giant stone man was, but it was extremely frightening to me. I only knew that inside the forest where the shaman led the stone man, a very large old tree was discovered, along with a large stone that looked very strange. There was a strange apartment in the apartment building where I was renting. Although this apartment was in the high-end segment, the rental price was very cheap. The current owner of the apartment was a young female office worker. She lived in an apartment alone and had only recently moved here. Until one day the girl was about to go to bed after a long day of working outside when she encountered a scary and strange thing right in her apartment. At that time, she was standing in the bathroom and looking in the mirror when suddenly, outside the door, there was a shadow of another girl with long, flowing hair looking at her from outside. The female office worker, the owner of the apartment, did not have time to understand what was happening when suddenly this woman moved quickly and rushed through the door. The young girl thought that a stranger had broken into her apartment, so she immediately ran out to check. When she went out, the hallway outside had become strangely cold and gloomy. The girl came from the bathroom and looked in the direction the strange woman had just passed. That woman also knew that the girl had seen her. She stood still, her back to the inside with a very mysterious gesture. Then, slowly the woman turned back. She looked monstrous, her eyes bloodshot like the devil, her skin pale and pale like a dead person. She looked at the girl with a devilish smile. The horror didn't stop there. The strange woman suddenly greeted the girl. The horror image in front of the girl made her bewildered. Knowing she had encountered something she couldn't have met, the girl could only explain in panic. Her screams echoed throughout the apartment block. But when they heard the screams coming from this apartment, no one who lived in the building dared to go to the apartment to check and act like they didn't know anything. The following day, the girl went to the building's management office to narrate everything that happened the previous night. After the young employee heard the story, he felt that this girl was just hallucinating, so he apologized profusely and reassured the girl with a few idle sentences to finish the story. This young man's superficial attitude made the girl even angrier. She demanded that the management return her rent and deposit. After saying that, the girl hurriedly went out and returned to her apartment to pack up her luggage, prepared to move to another apartment to live in because she no longer dared to stay in this place. When the girl left, the young man felt strange. He went to his boss and asked him why every guest in that apartment said the apartment was haunted. The boss heard, then sighed. When he was calm, he confirmed to the young man that what the girl said was true. When the young man heard that, he became more and more curious, asking his boss the beginning and the end of the story. After listening to this, the manager also slowly recalled and told the employee who had just come in to hear the story that had happened in this apartment. He said that the apartment was haunted by a case that happened nearly 10 years ago. At that time, the whole building was the most famous luxury apartment project in the city. In the same haunted apartment, its previous owner was a woman named Wing. She rented this apartment to live alone. Occasionally, her lover would visit and sleep over. Her affair was a wealthy but married businessman. The two had a long-standing affair because Wing's fiancé settled in the US and would welcome her to live there next year. Wing loved this mistress very much, but in the man's heart, Wing was just a stupid girl and had a lot of money. His purpose in approaching Wing was to extract her money. On the contrary, Wing was infatuated with the handsomeness and style of her lover. She determined to serve him to the end. That time, like so many other times before, he asked Wing for money under the pretense of investing in a business project. She waited until the lover was gone, then took out her phone and called her fiancé to ask for money. It was not the first time Wing had asked for money from her fiancé to give it to her lover. Every time she came up with compelling reasons. One day, Wing was asking for money from her fiancé as usual with the excuse to send it back to her family when suddenly disaster struck. It was around noon. The whole building was empty of people. No one noticed what was around them. Wing was sitting in the house talking on the phone when suddenly the doorbell rang. Curious, she turned off the phone and went out to check it out. Wing looked through the small window on the door, and outside was a middle-aged man, said to be the building management. Wing didn't think anything of it, opened the door, and invited the man inside with a carefree attitude. Unexpectedly, the door just opened. The man's arm pushed inside, making Wing suddenly unable to react. Two men suddenly burst into Wing's apartment, including her fiancé. He directly slapped her like hell and then blamed her for cheating on him. Wing then fell to the ground, powerless to resist. Her fiancé and his friend took her to her bedroom and assaulted her. Wing held the phone in one hand to call her lover and repeatedly plead with the other two men to spare her life. But her fiancé refused to agree to forgive her. He said he had to take revenge on her today. Both men walked in front of Wing. Wing screamed for help, but no one around could hear her screams. Her fiancé rushed over, grabbed Wing's hair, put her on the bed, and then with his friend did an act of debauchery with her. Wing screamed in pain and despair. Outside, her lover had also been standing there before, but he did not dare to enter because of his cowardice. He stood trembling in shock at the door and did not dare to shout for fear of being implicated. After a while of ideological struggle, Wing's lover also decided to leave the apartment, running straight out as if he didn't know anything. When her lover ran away, Wing's voice also stopped. The whole room fell into silence. Then two men from the apartment also came out. Wing was raped by both men and then strangled to death with a belt. Her body lay on the ground motionless, looking very pitiful. Wing's body lay there until the evening without anyone around or knowing what had happened. In the middle of the night, the lover decided to return to Wing's apartment by way of the balcony to get his phone back, and not wanting to be involved in Wing's affairs. He climbed through the window and went straight into Wing's bedroom. At that time, he did not know that Wing was already dead, so he calmly went inside. But when he got there, the lights of the apartment were turned off. He thought he could safely leave this troubled woman. He went to the kitchen first to check, but overall everything was neat and undisturbed. Then he sneaked into the bedroom, alone. In the darkness, he saw Wing lying dead on the ground, but his face showed no trace of panic. He searched the room in hopes of finding his phone quickly, and then left the scene before becoming a suspect in a murder. But before he could find his phone, he heard a cold breath behind him. And Wing's voice calling to him began to resound with hatred. He unconsciously turned back to check and saw that Wing had turned into a ghost with bloodshot eyes, her mouth constantly rebuking him for abandoning her. Her face revealed a terrifying horror. She cursed her lover to the fullest, scolded him severely, and forced him to stay with her forever. A moment later, in front of the betrayed mistress was a dark night. He screamed in terror and then turned into a madman. He found a chair in the house and prepared himself a noose on high, and then committed suicide. The bodies of both were found only when they were in a state of decomposition, emitting a stench. The case had not yet caught the main culprit. Since then, the souls of both had been trapped in the apartment, causing many tenants to move elsewhere. Some say they encountered a girl's spirit with a look of hatred. Others say they encountered a man. The story ends in the young man's panic. Later, the apartment was also locked and sealed, not allowing anyone to enter it ever again. It was a mysterious story about the forbidden forest in my village. To develop the economy, the government had widened the road to facilitate traffic. The big road was opened, leading to the investment of many rich business owners. They came here to develop an ecotourism area. According to the project, cranes and workers were sent to work. They embarked on replanting the forest, cutting down all the trees to get vacant land. But when the cleanup was complete, the workers discovered a huge old tree standing tall, almost as high as a hill. This discovery made the whole group of workers worried. They decided to wait until the following morning to blow up the stump. While observing, a worker working in the delegation discovered a dark figure standing on top looking down. He didn't know how the mysterious man got to the top. The man slowly walked from the inside to the side of the hill. His face was gradually revealed wrinkled like an older man with dark black eyes, wearing the village's long-standing collar. The worker's gaze could not escape the figure of the mysterious older man, but the more the worker looked, the more curious he felt in his heart. The worker seemed to be hypnotized, standing there for several minutes. It was not until a colleague from afar came to call him that he woke up. He pointed to the top of the tree stump and told his colleagues about seeing the mysterious older man standing aloft in a trembling voice. But strangely enough, when they both looked up, the strange older man had disappeared, leaving no trace. This thing made his colleagues laugh at him. No one believed the young worker's story. That evening, the working workers returned to their tents to rest. They gathered in a large tent to light a fire and talk. The group of workers sat by the fire playing cards. After a game, the young worker suddenly became uncomfortable, so he went back to his bed first. After that, everything went on as if nothing happened. Only the worker that night suddenly had a cold, as if he was sick. By the middle of the night, the cold air and fog surrounded the small tent. Outside, the sky shot up with a fierce flash of lightning. With only a few lightning bolts, the sky poured down a force and rushing rain, drenching the surrounding land. Inside the tent, the young worker felt more uncomfortable cold air on his toes running up his body. This thing caused his whole body to tremble with each convulsion. He turned around slightly, just in time to sound of the tent zipper sounding like someone who was coming in, and started calling his name. The whispering voice at the head of the bed made the young man unable to sleep. He opened his eyes a little to see what was going on. The worker looked dreamily towards the door, saw that it was bright outside. The rain and wind pulled into the cold tent. A dark shadow was slowly walking towards him. The young man couldn't make out the face of the person standing in front of the tent. He could only feel as if this person was wearing a form of traditional clothing and a hat that had been around for a long time. The older man walked like a fly, slowly entered the tent, and walked back to the front of the worker's bed. This thing caused the worker to panic and sat up. The appearance of the older man at this time also appeared in front of the young man. He was sure that he had seen a ghost. The eyes of the older man suddenly turned red with anger. He opened his mouth wide, shouting to chase these workers away. The worker heard every word this man said, so he nodded in agreement in panic. He kept saying that he would go now and begging his spirit to spare his life, then sat up, looking around with a panicked look in his eyes. His screams woke up other workers who were sleeping around. Everyone was surprised and asked him what was wrong. The worker at this time seemed to regain some consciousness, pointed out to the door of the tent, and recounted the dream he had met earlier. When his colleague heard about it, he remembered the incident in the afternoon and got angry, pulled the blanket and aggressively got out of the bed, forcing the worker to take him out to check. The two took a flashlight and went straight outside, grumbled, making everyone in the tent nervous. But after only a few minutes of searching with the searchlight, both workers also saw something strange that they should not have seen themselves. The strange phenomenon before their eyes made the two men feel anxious. They crept back into the tent to guard and observe. Both of the workers held flashlights and pointed forward where there was a bright yellow light, like fire, right at the base of the ancient tree in the afternoon. But when they looked closely, the old worker thought it was just an ordinary fire that was being magnified by being too close to the tent, causing the young worker to see it wrong. He turned to blame the young worker for not being careful, disturbing the sleep of other colleagues. But the young man didn't care, pointing forward. The colleague next to him saw this and looked in the direction of the hand. Both of them panicked when they saw that they had not been near any ancient trees until now, but this strange thing gave the workers here a bad premonition. The group woke up from the tent together, equipped with protective gear, and ran towards the direction of the ancient tree. Here they saw a bright yellow fire was burning fiercely, but as soon as the team reached the place, this fire was completely extinguished. In front of the group of workers also appeared a large cave. The workers followed the path leading to the bottom and were shocked to discover that 2 coffins had been placed here. The team was confused by what they had just found. Everyone was panicking and extremely worried because the team did not know how to deal with these 2 coffins. While the team was busy trying to find a solution, there was a loud sound from the tents, sounding like broken rock, very scary, making the whole team of workers look back in surprise. The incident happened in front of the workers' eyes as quickly as the blink of an eye. No one had time to move, they just stood still and watched the big rocks rolling down from above. The rocky hill behind the tents suddenly moved. The ground also trembled. There was also a crackling sound from the hillside and the sound of dust pouring down below. Huge rocks poured down below, pressing on the small tents. In the blink of an eye, rocks were able to level the ground. This thing was like a giant rock man, smashing the tents in front of him with his hands. Those who were present to witness a strange and scary event at that time could not keep their composure and also knew in their hearts that they had just made a big mistake that was difficult to repair. The team was seen to be dumbfounded by the wreckage right in front of them for a long time. But the young worker alone thought that this was also a blessing, because if they did not go out, they would also be crushed to death by these giant rocks. Looking at the crushed tents and the working tools of each worker, no one could help but feel pity. After regaining their spirits, the workers immediately discussed with each other, figuring out how to handle the messy things here. People were divided into groups to work. One group actively called the management report. Another group started going out to see if there were any tools left. The current situation made outsiders sigh because the working tools were no longer usable, and they had to wait for support from the manager. The rest of the group in the cave checked the neck of the coffin. Everyone began to work together to open the coffin lid to check inside and discovered a set of remains. Based on the remains of the bones, this was the remains of a man buried here in the last century. In the place where the coffin was found, the workers also found a long-standing hat for the village officials. The hat on the ground surprised the young worker because it was the same hat that the older man he saw was wearing. Lately, I heard my grandmother recount that the place was formerly the burial place of old mandarins. Although many coffins had been excavated for a long time, there was still a coffin of the first official in the village inside. After this incident, the other group of construction workers all resigned because they were so scared. The project was also stopped. Later, historians also came and excavated the surviving ancient tomb and brought it to another place for proper burial. I went on a business trip for a few days a long time ago. Fortunately, I was able to find a low-cost day-to-day apartment for rent near my workplace. I took the time after landing in the afternoon to have dinner, then carried my luggage to the apartment where I would be staying. The apartment that I rented was on the 3rd floor. The entire corridor had also very few rooms, and the quiet atmosphere made me quite happy. After finding my apartment, I took the key and was about to enter when I met a student girl walking up from the stairs who lived on the same floor as me. She became more timid as soon as she saw me, making me a little shy. I greeted her politely first, and she also responded. I introduced her that I was staying in this apartment. Suddenly, the girl's attitude changed. She looked at me with serious eyes and she said loudly, "You can't stay here." I just stood there surprised and perplexed, staring at her with my eyes wide open. I tried to ask her why I couldn't be here, but she kept saying, you can't, okay? You can't," instead of explaining anything else. After a few sentences, she hastily said goodbye to me and left, leaving me with a lot of unanswered questions in my head. I also wanted to keep her to stay to ask more questions, but it was late and I needed to rest, so I said nothing and kept doing my stuff. I carried my luggage into the room, couldn't help thinking about what the girl had said. I dashed to the bathroom as soon as I arrived to wash my face and took a shower. I went to my bedroom and sat on the large bed in the center of the room checking my phone. I was sitting on the bed, earphones in my ears, my gaze fixed on the exciting football match on the screen. Because this apartment only had one bedroom, the entire place had descended into a terrifying silence. I was so engrossed in the match that I screamed like a fan watching it live at the football pitch. After watching, I quickly placed my phone on the bed to prepare for food after a long and exhausting day of traveling. I soaked an Everescent tablet in a glass of water before going to bed to boost my resistance and started drinking it. My body began to feel tired after drinking. I immediately placed a glass of water on the dressing table beside the bed and began to recline. But as soon as I was looking down across the mirror, I noticed a dark figure reflecting in the mirror staring at me. I was startled unconsciously and quickly turned around to check, but there was no one behind me. The entire room was just me. I sighed, thinking I was so tired that I became dizzy. I forgot about the strange thing and went to bed, continuing to look at my phone and talk to my family. I started to feel sleepy at midnight, leaving me with no choice but to sleep. But I couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning. There was always a feeling in my heart that a certain heat was blowing up from under my bed. I started sweating on my brows, and the room had been drained of air, leaving only unpleasant hot air and a suffocating burning smell. I had the impression that someone was sitting behind me at the time, but I couldn't open my eyes to see because I was so tired, until the heat and burning smell became unbearable that I awoke, opened my eyes quickly and saw a thick grey smoke flying in front of me. I turned around in fear, startled. Two people as black as coal appeared in front of my eyes. Smoke erupted from their entire bodies and sat at my feet. Their bodies emitted the revolting odor of burnt meat. They didn't say anything and sat quietly on the bed, face down, eyes fixed on some unknown space. I tried to rub my eyes and regain my composure while staring at the two people in front of me. They appeared to be real human beings, but they had no skin, and the flesh beneath had been burned to black, revealing the muscles deep within the body. The biggest and most muscular one appeared to be a man, as his body looked to be very solid. I believed the person next to me was a woman. I saw her flesh melting in the smoke like an ice cream under the sun. I believed this was a prank by the apartment owner to defraud me of my rent, so I quickly drew up the blanket, sat up, and inquired as to who these two strange people were and why they were in my room. Both of them did not respond. Instead, they turned to face me with their deformed faces. They opened their mouths and moved their lips as if they wanted to say something but couldn't because of the burns on their mouth and tongue muscles. After a while, both of them stood up, their eyes fixed on me. I was so terrified by the scene that I froze. I held my hands tight on the bed, didn't dare to move. The heat and smoke also caused the sweat on the forehead to flow more profusely. After that, both black shadows rushed towards me and pressed against me, leaving me speechless. The two began to howl, expressed a great pain on their faces. The smoke was also becoming thicker, as if it wanted to swallow them both. Both of them kept rushing to me, looking at me with pleading eyes, but their mouths stiffened, unable to speak. When the man rushed over and grabbed my shoulders, then pressed his hot-burning body against mine, then I felt his body pressing against my face like a giant coal, causing me to scream in pain. After a while, the smoke and the hot air began to dissipate, but I felt as if I had entered a completely different world. My mind was racing like a drunk, and my limbs were frozen in place, making me hard to breathe. I found myself in this room in the blink of an eye, but the arrangement had changed, and there was now a couple sleeping on the bed. Outside, the husband neatly parked the motorcycle next to the door and carefully locked it. For no apparent reason, the bottom of the tire burst into flames. The fire engulfed the motorcycle in an instant, incinerating it in just a few minutes. The couple was awakened by the sound of the engine crackling outside and the smell of smoke. They were both startled to sit up when they saw the fire spread throughout the house. The fire burned the entire door and then spread all over 4 corners of the wall, followed the brick floor below to attack the couple's bed and burned the blanket below. Because there was no way out, the couple was trapped inside, preying on the raging fire. The scene appeared to be hell. The young couple writhed in the sea of fire, their bodies shrinking and turning black. The fire eventually turned them both into disfigured skeletons, blackened and stiff as coal. Everything in this room was completely burned down when the rescue team arrived. After the dream ended, I was startled to find myself in the same accident room, confused and unsure of what was going on. My head throbbed with excruciating pain at the same time. I had to try to hold my head before crawling up, only to discover that I had been lying on the ceramic floor for who knows how long. I exhaled laboriously. Fortunately, what I saw was either the past of the room or a nightmare, and I was still safe and sound. I was haunted by the nightmare. Later, I discovered that this apartment had a fire before, and that the house's owner couple had also died in the fire. The next day, I contacted to give back the room and quickly found myself a new room. The owner was also aware of the reason, so he did not make things difficult for me, and I relocated to another apartment. My father lost his arm when he was young. I tried many times to ask the cause, but it was not until now that my father told me about that thrilling story. At that time, my father had just married my mother not long ago and lived in a high mountain surrounded by only wild animals and plants. To make a living, my father had to go to the mountains to hunt wild animals. Once my father went to the mountains to hunt animals in a snow-covered sky. In the distance he saw a wild rabbit. Waiting until this rabbit didn't notice, my father opened fire. The bullet went through the poor rabbit's abdomen, causing it to fall on the spot, stiffening its whole body. The rabbit then tried to roll a few more laps in the snow and then collapsed. My father saw it all from afar. He hid behind a large tree nearby and then slowly walked out to check the animal's condition. My father tried to make his way through the line of thick white snow, straight to the rabbit's direction. His eyes did not forget to look around to watch out for wild animals. When my father was only a few meters away from the hare, he heard footsteps and animal sounds in the distance. My father realized that this was the sound of a small animal's footsteps, so he suddenly looked up. Accidentally, he saw a cave. Inside it was covered with several layers of straw and dry leaves. My dad guessed it was the cave of the rabbit he shot down. In his heart, then, rose a feeling of guilt and awkwardness. Suddenly next to him came the sound of wild animals. My father looked up and saw a group of white foxes coming out of nowhere, standing around the carcass of the little rabbit. My father scratched his head and thought to himself, this group of white foxes must have been in the forest for a long time and had no food, but now they could smell wild game meat, so they pulled the whole group out like that. So my father decided to give this rabbit to the foxes, and he went to another place to continue hunting. This time, he decided to go deeper into the forest. He hoped to catch more rabbits or some other big animal for my mother to make dinner. My father's gunshot rang out continuously, but there was only one more hare. My father thought that one rabbit would be enough, so when he saw the rabbit lying motionless, he slowly went out to check. He had only taken a few steps when suddenly, my father heard a loud noise and a cold breath appeared from behind him. The footsteps of wild animals also sounded from there, but they were getting closer and closer to my father. My father, out of curiosity, quietly went to the place where the noise was coming from. He hoped to find another animal for himself. But when he arrived, in front of him suddenly appeared a grizzly bear, a head taller than him, busy looking for food. As soon as it saw my father, the grizzly bear determined that this would be his prey, so it rushed forward, its eyes also starting to turn red in anger. The bear rushed through the trees and grabbed my father. Then it opened its big mouth and bit my father's hand hard. My father screamed in pain. He was overwhelmed by the weight and the huge body of this bear crushed on the ground. He was unable to resist. It attacked my father so fast that he could not fire a gun to fight back. The wound also began to appear intense pain. My father writhed on the ground, one hand clutching the bleeding wound. At this point, my father seemed to have completely collapsed and lost all hope. The bear saw my father screaming. It thought that my father was threatening it, so the anger in its heart also increased because of that. It roared loudly, shouting straight at my father's face as if it wanted to eat him alive in one shot. My father was too scared, plus the freezing cold of the winter mountains, leading to a loss of strength and slowly fainting. He seemed to have no more faith anymore, so he closed his eyes and surrendered his fate to God to decide. His whole body was no longer able to move and was as cold as an iceberg. It took a long time for my father to regain his sanity. He was like a man who fell asleep in the forest. He woke up and opened his eyes to see. He realized he was still lying in the forest on the white snow, but the big bear had disappeared. He started to get up, making his way home. The wound on his head also continued to ache, even though the blood had been frozen by the snow. He looked around for his direction, but the snow was so heavy that it blocked his path. Suddenly a shadow appeared in front of him. This strange figure slowly approached my father. He recognized it as a young girl with a mysterious appearance. He knew that it was a strange thing for a young girl to appear in the forest, but because he had no other hope, he took a risk and chased after the girl. Suddenly she turned around, looked at my father with eyes as bright as a fox's eye, and coldly told my father to follow her. My father was bewildered and did not understand anything, but his mind was now hypnotized, only following this girl unconsciously. The girl kept walking straight ahead through the blizzard as if nothing had happened, leaving my father to remain puzzled. When my father felt that he couldn't keep going straight ahead anymore, he called the girl over to ask. But my father just opened his mouth when the whole person fell into a state of loss of feeling. My father no longer remembered anything after that, only remembering that time his mind was spinning blank, walking behind the girl even though he did not know who this girl was. The strange girl continued to lead my father in a straight line. They went through the dry, snowy trees, little by little out of the murky, dangerous forest. Then this girl took my father to a cliff. Since then my father had never crossed this road, but as long as he followed the girl, he could cross this cliff very easily. At the same time, at home, my mother saw that the snow was falling more and more densely, but my father hadn't returned. One insecurity also began to appear in her heart, so she decided to risk going alone into the forest to find my father. My mother quickly put on her shirt and went out nervously. But when my mother came out, she suddenly saw that my father had returned to the front of the house in a lifeless form. My father's whole body was cold to blue and purple all over his body. He could only stand motionless and couldn't do anything else. My mother saw this, panicked, and rushed to hug my father, feeling the cold that turned his body into a giant iceberg. After my mother touched his body, he immediately fainted. My mother was scared, struggling and confused, not knowing what to do, nor understanding what had happened. My mother called for a long time but did not see my father answer. He was still seriously injured, causing him to panic. My mother tried to help my father, but she was pulled by the weight of my father's frozen body to the ground. My mother tried to call and shake him, but my father still couldn't wake up. But at the same time, my mother accidentally looked outside the gate to see which benefactor had brought him home and saw a strange thing. In the snow, falling more and more, my mother saw the faint shadows of a flock of small foxes. They stood far enough away from my house and refused to come any closer. My mother also gradually understood the problem, so she brought my father inside. After seeing that their father had reached home safely, the foxes also quietly returned to the deep forest and disappeared. The most impressive of my mother in the story was the fox in the middle, with bright blue eyes and white fur that blends in with the snow, constantly watching the house. The doctor then also came to check on my father's condition. Fortunately, he still managed to save his life, but the wound on his hand was severely necrotic and had to be amputated. Both my father and mother were heartbroken over that. That was why my father stopped hunting, but he still didn't forget his strange story in his heart. Not only that, but he also considered it to be the other fox elf that turned into a human to help him find his way home. After that, my father tried to return to the forest to find the foxes many times, but he had never seen them ever again.